the summer of 1965, a state trooper named Michael Garrett pulled over on a dirt road in southwestern Virginia because he thought he saw children standing in the middle of nowhere. It was just past dawn. The mist was still heavy between the trees. He said later that what bothered him most wasn't that they were alone. It was that they didn't move when they saw his car. They just stood there, watching. When he got closer, he said their eyes looked wrong. Not scared, not lost, just aware. Too aware. What happened next would never make it into any official report. The children were taken. The town was told to forget. And for nearly 60 years, most people did. But the families who lived near Blackthorn Ridge, they still won't talk about it. Not because they don't remember, because they do. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. This is the story of the Blackthorn Ridge children. 7 kids, no parents, no records, and eyes that had seen things no child should ever see. The state wanted them hidden, the church wanted them saved, but the doctors who examined them, they wanted answers to questions they didn't even know how to ask. Because when those children finally spoke, they didn't talk like kids. They talked like they'd been alive much, much longer. And what they said about where they came from would haunt everyone who heard it. Trooper Garrett radioed it in at 6:43 in the morning. He told dispatch he'd found 7 children on Old Corbin Road, about 2 miles past the turnoff to Blackthorn Ridge. Ages looked to be between 5 and 12. No adults in sight. No vehicles. No homes for miles. When they asked him if the children seemed distressed, there was a long pause on the radio. Then he said something that still sits in the archived recording. He said, "They're calm. Too calm. Like they've been waiting." By the time Sheriff Raymond Duluth arrived with 2 deputies and a county social worker named Patricia Hines, the children were sitting in a perfect line on the side of the road. Not playing, not crying, just sitting. Patricia would later describe it in a letter to her sister as the most unnatural thing she'd ever witnessed. She said children don't sit like that, not even well-behaved ones. They fidget, they look around. These children barely blink. The oldest, a girl, was asked her name. She looked at Patricia for a long moment, then said, "We don't use those anymore." When asked where their parents were, the girl's face didn't change. She said, "They're still there, in the house." But there was no house, not on that road, not anywhere close. The deputies searched the area for hours. Nothing, just trees and old barbed wire fences and the smell of wet earth. What made it worse was the way the other children reacted when the girl spoke. They all turned their heads at the exact same time, like they'd heard a signal no one else could. One of the deputies, a man named Carl Fry, said it reminded him of birds, the way a whole flock moves together, like they share one mind. He said it made his skin crawl. They were taken to Riverside Children's Services in the neighboring county. On the drive, none of them asked where they were going. Patricia tried to comfort the youngest boy, who couldn't have been older than 6. She put her hand on his shoulder and told him everything would be okay. He turned to her with eyes that seemed far too steady and said, "You don't know what okay means yet." Then he looked back out the window and didn't speak again for 3 days. But here's the part that should have been in every newspaper in Virginia. It wasn't. Because by the time the children were examined, someone much higher up had already made a phone call. And once that call was made, the story stopped being about lost children. It became about something the state needed to bury, and they almost succeeded. Dr. Emil Thornburg was the chief pediatrician at Riverside, and he'd seen plenty of neglected children in his 18 years of practice. Abuse cases, abandonment, malnutrition. But when he walked into the examination room that first afternoon and saw the Blackthorn children sitting in a row on the benches, he said something felt immediately wrong. Not medically wrong, something deeper. He described it later in his private notes as a feeling of being watched by something pretending to be innocent. Physically, the children appeared healthy. No signs of starvation, no bruising. Their clothes were old-fashioned, handmade from rough cotton and wool, like something out of the 1930s. But they weren't dirty. Their hair had been recently washed. Their fingernails were clean. It was as if someone had been caring for them right up until the moment they appeared on that road. But who? And where had they come from? When Thornburg tried to examine the oldest girl, she allowed it without protest. She sat perfectly still, arms at her sides, staring straight ahead. He checked her eyes, her throat, her reflexes, everything normal. Then he asked her how old she was. She tilted her head slightly, as if considering how to answer a question that didn't quite make sense. Finally, she said, "This body is 11. Thornburg stopped writing. He asked her to repeat herself. She looked directly at him and said it again, slower. "This body is 11. He asked what she meant. She didn't answer. She just smiled. A small, patient smile. The kind you'd give a child who asked a question they weren't ready to understand. The nurse assisting him, a woman named Dorothy Grant, later reported that she had to leave the room. She said the girl's smile made her feel like she was the one being examined, like something was studying her through the child's face. When Dorothy came back 20 minutes later, the girl was still sitting in the exact same position, still smiling. Thornburg had moved on to examining the others, but Dorothy said she could feel the girl's eyes following her around the room. Then came the blood work. Standard procedure for unidentified children. The results came back 3 days later, and that's when Dr. Thornburg made a call to the state health department, because according to the tests, something was off, not diseased, not abnormal in any way that made medical sense. But the cellular markers, the bone density readings, the development patterns, they didn't match the children's apparent ages. The youngest boy, who looked 6, had bone density consistent with someone in their late teens. The oldest girl had markers in her blood that suggested her immune system had been exposed to illnesses that hadn't existed in Virginia since the early 1900s. Thornburg wrote in his notes, "It's as if these children's bodies are younger than their biology. I don't know how else to explain it." But before he could investigate further, 2 men in dark suits arrived at Riverside. They had federal identification. They didn't give names. They confiscated Thornburg's notes, the blood samples, and every photograph taken of the children. Then they told him the children were being transferred to a private facility for psychological evaluation. When Thornburg protested, one of the men leaned in close and said, "Doctor, you've done your job. Now let us do ours." He never saw the children again, and within a week, every record of their arrival at Riverside had vanished. But Thornburg kept a copy of his notes, hidden, and years later, his daughter found them. The children were moved to a place called Westfield Manor, about 90 miles north of Riverside. Officially, it was listed as a state psychiatric facility for adolescents. Unofficially, it was where Virginia sent cases that didn't fit into any normal category. Children who'd witnessed things they shouldn't have, families involved in cult activity, kids whose testimony was too disturbing for a courtroom. Westfield wasn't about healing. It was about containment and silence. Dr. Irene Caldwell was assigned to the Blackthorn children. She was a clinical psychologist specializing in trauma and dissociation. She'd worked with children who'd survived horrific abuse, kids who'd fractured into multiple identities just to cope. But when she sat down with the first child, a boy named Thomas, or at least that's what they'd decided to call him, she realized very quickly that this wasn't trauma. This was something else entirely. Thomas sat across from her in a small room with white walls and a single window. He was maybe 8 years old, dark hair, pale skin. He looked at her the way an adult looks at a stranger on a bus. Polite, distant, uninterested. Caldwell asked him if he knew why he was there. He said, "You want to know where we came from?" She asked if he'd like to tell her. He shrugged and said, "You wouldn't believe it. Not yet." She asked what he meant by "not yet." He leaned forward slightly, hands folded in his lap, and said, "Because you still think we're children." Caldwell tried a different approach. She asked him about his earliest memory. Most children, even traumatized ones, will recall something simple. A toy, a smell, a face. Thomas closed his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them, he said, "I remember the crossing. The woods were burning. We had to leave the old skins behind." Caldwell wrote it down, assuming it was symbolic. She asked what he meant by old skins. He looked at her like she'd asked what water was. He said, "The ones we had before, the ones that got used up." Then he stopped talking. Completely. For the next 3 sessions, he wouldn't say another word. He would just sit there, staring at her, occasionally glancing at the clock like he was waiting for her to figure something out on her own. The girl they called Mary was different. She spoke freely, too freely. Caldwell's notes from those sessions were later described by a colleague as deeply unsettling. Mary talked about a house that wasn't on any map. She described rooms that went on forever, hallways that looped back into themselves, windows that showed different seasons depending on which side you looked from. She said the house had been there long before any of them, that it had called to them, that it needed them. When Caldwell asked why, Mary tilted her head and said, "Because it was hungry, and we were the only ones left who remembered how to feed it." Caldwell asked her what the house ate. Mary smiled, that same patient smile Dr. Thornburg had described. She said, "Time. It ate time, and when you stay there long enough, it starts eating you too, piece by piece, year by year, until you're not who you were anymore, until you're something older." Caldwell tried to stay clinical. She asked if Mary was speaking metaphorically. Mary laughed, a soft, sad laugh. She said, "You think we're confused. You think we're making up stories because something bad happened to us. But we're not the ones who are confused, Dr. Caldwell. You are. You think time only moves one way. You think children are always young. But we've been young for so long now, we forgot how to be anything else." Then Mary looked out the window and said something that Caldwell would never forget. She said, "The house is still there. It's always there. And one day, you'll all have to go inside. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline?" Dr. Caldwell did something she wasn't supposed to do. She started looking for the house. At night, after her shifts ended, she would drive out toward Blackthorn Ridge with a county map spread across her passenger seat. She talked to locals in gas stations and diners. Most of them wouldn't say much. A few got quiet when she mentioned the children. One old man, a farmer named Henry Rost, finally told her something useful. He said there used to be a house out past the ridge, a big one, built sometime in the 1880s by a family named Mercer, but it burned down in 1938. At least, that's what people said. He paused, then added, "But my father used to say it didn't burn all the way. Said some things don't burn right. They just wait." Caldwell found the location on a surveyor's map from 1942. It was listed as private property, ownership unclear, marked with a notation that simply read, "Structure, status unknown." She drove out there on a Sunday morning in late September. The road was overgrown. The forest had reclaimed most of it. But she found the clearing, and she found the foundation, blackened stone, collapsed beams, shattered glass half buried in the dirt. It looked like every other abandoned ruin she'd ever seen. Except for one thing, the air felt wrong, thick. She said later it was like walking into a room where something terrible had just happened, but you arrived too late to see what it was. She took photographs. She collected samples of the wood and stone, and then she noticed something that made her stomach turn. In the dirt near the collapsed doorway, there were footprints, small ones, children's shoes, fresh, maybe a day old. She looked around, suddenly aware of how alone she was. The trees seemed too quiet, no birds, no wind, just silence pressing in from all sides. She left quickly, the feeling of being watched crawling up her spine the entire walk back to her car. When she returned to Westfield and confronted Mary with the photographs, the girl's expression didn't change. She looked at the images of the burnt foundation and nodded slowly. "You found it," she said quietly. "Or it let you find it?" Caldwell asked what she meant. Mary touched the photograph with one finger, tracing the outline of the collapsed doorway. "It's not gone," she said. "It's just folded. Like a letter you put away but never throw out. It's still there. You just have to know how to open it." Caldwell demanded answers. She asked Mary how 7 children could have been living in a burned-out ruin with no food, no water, no heat. Mary looked up at her with those 2 old eyes and said, "We weren't living there, Doctor. We were kept there, and the house doesn't need food or water. It needs something else. It needs people who remember, people who carry the old time inside them. That's what we are. We're the ones who couldn't leave, even when our bodies got too young to remember why." Then Mary said something that Caldwell wrote down word for word, underlining it 3 times in her notes. She said, "The house doesn't let you die. It just makes you start over, again and again, until you forget you were ever anything else. We've been children for 70 years, Doctor. Some of us even longer. And the worst part, we can still remember being old." Caldwell asked if there were others. Mary nodded. There were more, but they faded. When you've been young too long, you start to disappear. like a photograph left in the Sunday. We're the ones who held on. Barely. She looked down at her hands, small and pale. But we're fading too. That's why we left. The house was going to fold us in completely, make us part of the walls, part of the waiting. Caldwell left that session shaking. She went to her supervisor, a man named Dr. Paul Everett, and told him everything. He listened. He read her notes. Then he closed the file and told her she was being reassigned, effective immediately. The Blackthorn case was being transferred to federal jurisdiction. When she protested, he said something that still chills anyone who reads the transcripts. He said, "Irene, there are things the state doesn't want solved. There are answers that cause more problems than the questions ever did. Let this one go, for your own sake." But Caldwell couldn't let it go. And 3 weeks later, she went back to the house, alone. This time, she didn't come back for 2 days. When she finally returned, she wouldn't speak about what she'd seen. She resigned from Westfield shortly after, moved out of state. Her colleagues said she looked 10 years older. Her hands shook when she held a pen, and she would never, ever talk about Blackthorn Ridge again. On November 14th, 1965, the Blackthorn children disappeared from Westfield Manor. Not escaped, disappeared. The doors were still locked, the windows were still barred. The night staff reported nothing unusual during their rounds at midnight and again at 3 in the morning. But when the day shift arrived at 7, the children's rooms were empty. The beds were made. Their few belongings were gone. And on each pillow, there was a single item left behind: a dried flower, black petals, thorn-like stems, the kind that only grew wild in the forests around Blackthorn Ridge. The official report called it a coordinated escape, assisted by an outside party. But no alarms had been triggered, no locks had been forced. The security footage from that night showed nothing but empty hallways and closed doors. Except for one thing that nobody could explain. At 2:47 in the morning, every camera in the building went dark for exactly 3 minutes. When they came back on, everything looked the same. But the children were already gone. The FBI was called in. They searched the grounds. They interviewed every staff member. They brought in dogs to track scents. The dogs refused to enter the children's wing. They would get to the doorway, stop, and back away with their tails between their legs. One handler said his dog, a German shepherd trained for cadaver recovery, started whining and wouldn't stop until they left the building. He said he'd never seen the animal act that way before, not even at mass grave sites. Search parties combed the woods around Westfield for weeks. They found nothing, no footprints, no torn clothing, no signs anyone had passed through at all. It was as if 7 children had simply ceased to exist. The case was quietly closed. 6 months later, the files were sealed. The families who'd been searching for missing children matching the Blackthorn descriptions were told there was no match. The whole thing was buried under layers of bureaucracy and classified stamps and convenient memory loss. But the locals knew. The people who lived near Blackthorn Ridge, they knew the children had gone back to the house that wasn't supposed to be there anymore. Back to the folded place Mary had talked about. Some people reported seeing lights in the woods at night. Not flashlights, not campfires. A different kind of light, pale and cold and wrong. It moved between the trees like it was looking for something. Or someone. A hunter named Dale Cunningham claimed he saw them in the spring of 1966. He was tracking a deer about a mile from the old Mercer property when he came across a clearing he'd never seen before. And in the center of it, there was a door. Just a door, standing upright in the middle of nothing. No frame, no walls, just a door made of black wood with rusted hinges, and standing in front of it were the children, all 7 of them. They were holding hands in a circle, singing something low and rhythmic. He said it didn't sound like any language he knew, but it made his teeth hurt. When one of them turned and looked at him, he ran. Didn't stop running until he reached his truck. He never went back into those woods again. Others reported similar things over the years. A door that appeared and disappeared. Children's voices singing in the dark. The smell of smoke and burnt wood where no fire had been. And always, that feeling of being watched by something patient. Something that had all the time in the world. Because time, in that place, didn't work the way it was supposed to. The state wanted everyone to forget. The church wanted to pray it away. But the families who'd lost people to those woods, they knew better. They knew the house was still there, still hungry, still waiting. And the children? They were still inside, Not dead, not alive, just caught, folded into a place where years could pass like days, and days could stretch into lifetimes, where you could be a child forever, but remember being so much older, where the walls whispered your name in voices you used to have. And the most terrifying part, the door was still out there, somewhere in those woods, waiting for someone else to find it, waiting for someone else to open it, because the house always needed more. It always needed someone who remembered, someone who carried time inside them like a wound that wouldn't heal. In 1993, a documentary filmmaker named Rachel Ostroff tried to investigate the Blackthorn Ridge case. She'd heard rumors, read old newspaper clippings that mentioned unnamed children found in Virginia. She tracked down Patricia Hines, the social worker who'd been there the day they were discovered. Patricia was 71 by then, living in a nursing home in North Carolina. When Rachel asked her about the children, Patricia's face went pale. She said, "I knew someone would come asking eventually. I hoped I'd be dead first." Then she told Rachel something she'd never told anyone. She said on the drive to Riverside that day, she'd looked in the rearview mirror and seen all 7 children staring back at her. Not at the road, not at each other, at her. And in that moment, she'd felt something she couldn't explain. A recognition, like she'd seen those faces before. Not in this life, but somewhere, sometime. She said it felt like they'd been waiting for her specifically, like she was supposed to be part of something, but she'd gotten away. Barely. Rachel tried to find the other people involved. Sheriff Duluth had died in 1978. Heart attack. He was only 52. Trooper Garrett had disappeared in 1971. His car was found abandoned on Old Corbin Road, the same road where he'd found the children. His body was never recovered. Dr. Thornburg had passed away in 1986, but his daughter agreed to meet with Rachel. She brought the hidden notes her father had kept, and she brought something else, a photograph. It had been tucked into the back of his journal. It showed the 7 children standing in a line at Riverside, but there was something wrong with the image. Behind the children, barely visible, there was a shadow on the wall, except the shadow didn't match the children's positions. It was taller, wider, shaped wrong. And if you looked closely, really closely, you could see it had too many arms. Rachel took the photograph to a specialist. He confirmed it hadn't been tampered with. Whatever had been captured in that image had been there in the room. The specialist asked where the photo was taken. When Rachel told him, he went quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I'd burn this if I were you. Some things don't want to be remembered, and when you remember them, they remember you back." Rachel didn't burn it. She kept investigating. She drove out to Blackthorn Ridge in the fall of 1993 with a camera crew. They found the old Mercer property, they found the foundation, and they found something else. Carved into one of the remaining stones were words. Freshly carved. The edges were still sharp. It read, "We are still here. We are always here. The door is open for those who remember." Rachel filmed it. She documented everything, but when she tried to leave, her crew got turned around. They walked in circles for 3 hours in woods they swore they knew. The sun started setting, and that's when they heard it. Children singing. That same low, rhythmic sound Dale Cunningham had described, coming from deeper in the trees, coming from everywhere and nowhere. They ran, made it back to their vehicles. Rachel left Virginia the next day and never returned. The footage was never released. When asked about it years later in an interview, she would only say, "Some stories don't want to be told, and when you try to tell them anyway, they follow you home." She refused to elaborate, but people who knew her said she'd changed after that trip. She started locking her doors obsessively. She wouldn't go into forests anymore. And sometimes, late at night, she'd wake up convinced she heard children singing just outside her window. The Blackthorn Ridge children were never found. The case remains officially unsolved. The files are still sealed, and the people who know the truth, most of them are dead now, but the house is still there, folded, waiting. And every few years, someone goes missing in those woods. A hiker, a hunter, a curious teenager. They're found days later, if they're found at all, confused and disoriented. They talk about doors that shouldn't exist, voices that sound like children, and a feeling that something very old was watching them, studying them, deciding if they were worth keeping. The locals don't go near Blackthorn Ridge anymore. They warn their children to stay away. They tell stories around campfires about the house that eats time and the children who never grew old. And late at night, when the wind moves through those trees, some people swear they can still hear it. The singing, soft and patient and endless, a lullaby from something that was never really a child, something that just wore the shape of one, something that's still waiting in the folded dark for the next person to open the door and step inside. Because the house doesn't forget. It never forgets. And once it knows your name, once it sees you, it will wait forever for you to come back. Because in that place, forever is just another word for now. And the children, they're not lost. They're exactly where they've always been, standing in a circle, holding hands, singing a song that was old when the world was young, singing it for you, hoping you'll hear, hoping you'll remember, hoping you'll finally come home. And maybe, just maybe, you already have. If this story stayed with you, if it made you feel something you can't quite name, leave a comment below. Tell us if you've ever felt watched in the woods, if you've ever seen something you couldn't explain. Because the more we remember these stories, the more real they become. And sometimes, being remembered is exactly what they want. Thank you for watching, and remember, some doors should stay closed.